20th to hit the internets on April 21st. How's everybody doing? Enjoying your day? Oh, that's good. That's good to hear. You deserve it. You did it. Remember, you can listen to the show on iTunes, TuneIn, Radio, Stitcher, YouTube, and follow me on Twitter at BrianBuck13 and at Red Ticket Blues. The show is on Google Play if that's your thing, or it should be. I think it periodically they're adding more podcasts to it. It's not a instant process, so check there if you want to do that. Follow me on Twitter at BrianBuck13 and at Red Ticket Blues. So today's another weekly edition of the Thursday Talk where we have a guest, and that guest this week is author Timothy Sullivan. He wrote the book Imus, Mike and the Mad Dog, Doris from Rego Park, the groundbreaking history of WFAN. So we get into how WFAN started, all chronicled in his wonderful book, which I encourage everyone to pick up. Yes. But we get into his preparation to getting in, who gave the most information, how the whole book project came about. So let's take a listen. He is the author of Imus, Mike and the Mad Dog, Doris from Rego Park, the groundbreaking history of WFAN, and that of course is Tim Sullivan. Tim, thanks for being on the Red Ticket Blues podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it.
No problem. I mean, you wrote the definitive book that is part of many, many people's lives. But before we get into that book, a book that any WFAN diehard must read, let's know a little bit about you and your personal relationship with WFAN. When did you start listening?
Good question. I was one of a legion of thousands, I guess, back when their station first started. Growing up in the New York, New Jersey area in the 80s. When the station went to air, I guess a lot of people didn't know what to expect. I was one of them, but I was young, impressionable. I wanted in the radio business at the time, in sports media in some form, whether it was writing radio, broadcasting, play-by-play. I just wanted in, and I knew that as a high school kid, when I heard this station, one thing I was going to do for sure is just listen to it as much as I possibly could. I wasn't one of those that feared that it was going to fail. I didn't know any better, I'm sure, and fell in love with the station almost immediately. It had everything that I needed as a kid that was growing up without the internet, without Twitter, without social media, without even many of the thousands of TV stations that we have today. Sports radio, when it broke onto the scene with WFAN, was realistically all I ever needed. And, everything that they thought that they were going to be when they started, for me, that was plenty.
Now, so you've listened for a while. I have to ask, have you ever called in?
I did call in when I first started. I was too young many times. Sometimes I could get through to the overnight shows, but when I was in high school, 13, 14, 15 years old, it all depended on who picked up the phone and who the producer was at the time. They did have a minimum age of 18 back then, but sometimes I won't tell a lie. I was able to sneak on the air on the overnight show.
I'm immediately contacting WFAN about that. They're immediately being contacted. So who did you call, and what were you calling about?
I would call for any one of the number of times, whatever was the hottest story of the day. It was often maybe the Yankees or Mets, or maybe even a hockey question overnight with Steve Summers. And he was, as you know, he wrote the foreword for my book, certainly an idol of mine growing up, as professional then as he was 20 years ago when he was helping me to write a book. He took a 13-year-old's phone call and didn't make fun of it. And if my voice had changed yet, I was probably very high-pitched. He had some fun with it, and memories I'll never forget.
Not to name drop, but what the hell? Friend of the podcast, Steve Summers, of course.
Absolutely.
Let's see. Now, you talk about the book, you're putting the book together. So what separates you from the people, like you said, the thousands of people that listen? When, what happened that made you say, I want to write a book about WFAN?
That's a good question. I would say that I always had it in the back of my mind. As I was growing up in the business as a sports writer and then a sports editor at the New York Post, I wanted to certainly take a step back at some point in my career and become an author in general. Fortunately, I was given that opportunity. I kind of looked at it. People who are, in our business and sort of grow up through the business realize quickly that, there aren't any get-rich-quick schemes, and you end up in many pockets doing what you do because you love it. And one thing I wanted to do when writing books, if I was fortunate enough to ever write one, I'm fortunate now to have written two, was to write the books that I wanted to write, and certainly didn't need to make money off it. Wasn't looking at it to change my life or anyone's lives really. I just wanted to sort of tell the stories of some of the more important stories of my life and how I became passionate about sports and the sports media. And fortunately, I was able to do that. My first book on the Rangers and Devils rivalry came out in 2012, and that was able to spin right off into the FAN book, which is the one that I really wanted to write. It was just a tough sell originally as a first-time author. As a second-time author, I was able to really sell my ideas a little bit stronger. And even, quite frankly, if I started that in 2005 or 2006 when I first got back to New York, I think it would have been a tough sell. I think when I got to a point in 2012 and 13, probably because of the the rise of social media and Mike Francesa on there, probably because Mad Dog left, whatever the case may be, FAN was certainly more of a national station in 2011 and 12 than it was when I first started to think about writing this book. So that's the exposure certainly helped. Mike, Chris on satellite radio, Mike all over the place, and Twitter taking off with FAN in general. That really helped and was able to help me secure my dream, 3 years ago.
Social media makes everything better or completely worse. There's no in between. You mentioned your book before, just for you hockey fans out there. Battle on the Hudson: The Devils, the Rangers, and NHL's Greatest Series Ever is the book Tim was referring to. So you got into WFAN here, and you're deciding to put the book together. How did WFAN react when you approach them and say, "Hey, I'm writing a book about you guys. Want to help out?"
Interesting question. I would say for sure in compiling research and interviews and material for that first book on the Rangers, I was able to speak to so many FAN personalities along the way. So that certainly helped break the ice a little bit. When I got through to Mark Chernoff, the boss at WFAN, a year later after my first book had come out, I was surprised at two things. I tell the story a lot that he said. One, that I'm not the first person to come to him about a book. Go ahead, go for it. You have our blessing. And he also said, all those people that I talked to before have never come back to me. So I kind of took it on that as a challenge. I was really appreciative for sure that they were able to open up to me and give me the access that I needed to write the book. But I also took it as a challenge, as one that I could certainly tell that I don't know how many people, 2, 3, 4 people in the past may have tried to do this or wanted to do it and didn't. I certainly used that for me as a motivator.
So once you get in there, you're taking on that challenge. You don't have to be specific, but did the direction or the premise change once you got your feet wet in this for what you set out to do in the first place?
It may have changed a little bit. I certainly wanted to be, an historical perspective of a station that I felt very much that I grew up with, and I wanted to be able to tell that story for the most part for the fans that also grew up with it, whatever age they may have been, whether they're my age now and they grew up with it when they're in high school, or whether they are those folks' children who drove in their car with their dads to Yankee Stadium or Madison Square Garden or Shea Stadium listening to the fan. I wanted it to be a generational New York tale, for lack of a better term, and I wanted to do that from a historical perspective, realistically from the beginning to current day. If I look back on it, there's probably a lot. I may have done a few things differently. I think, when I was first putting the body of this together in 2011, as we've mentioned, just recently before, that, I think that Chris Russo and Mike Francesa are even larger personalities now than they were even then. Whether it's FrancesaCon, whether it's Benefits at Radio City, whether it's Mike and the Mad Dog documentaries, they are bigger now afterwards than they were almost before. And I think if I look back on that, the body of this book, I certainly wanted to do a historical perspective. I just wanted to pay respect to all the people who were a part of that station and a part of its success. I did that. But I also think, looking back on it, I think everybody would do some things differently. I probably would have given a little bit more material to the Mike and the Mad Dog before, during, and after. As it was already 5 chapters of the book. It should have even been more when you consider how big those 2 figures are now.
Yeah, a lot of it's happened. I mean, like you said, they're enormous. But even in the last, since you've written the book, I mean, if they've taken on sort of lives of their own. So, I mean, you couldn't do it all then because it hadn't actually transpired. So we won't hold you to that.
Appreciate that.
No problem. But okay, so you mentioned Mike and the Mad Dog and Imus. We would know that they're parts of the beginning of the conception of WFAN. So I mean, let me ask you this, and you talk about it in the book. Was there a need for a new format in the area, or was the world all of a sudden just dying for sports radio and it had to be done?
I think that in some of the offices of some radio executives across the country, I think it was a concept, yes, that they thought that, one of these theories that throw it out on the wall and see if it sticks. I think some people were clamoring for it. I think there were enough stations at the time that were doing 1 and 2 hour spots of sports talk radio here and there. Certainly was happening in New York, maybe in and out of live games that some news stations had. But I don't know that anyone really thought it was going to end up being what it's ended up becoming. And, FAN struggled for a little bit for a while in selling ads and getting people to believe that you could listen to and want to listen to, really, sports 24 hours a day. I think in the early days when they were trying to get advertisers and trying to get traction, people to come listen to them 24 hours a day, that's really what they struggled with. Should they be a national sports radio station where they were talking about golf and boxing matches and the Lakers, as opposed to should we just be talking about the Giants, Jets, Knicks, Rangers, St. John's, whatever was big in New York at the time? I think at first, without question, they thought it needed to be a national focus. That's why Jim Lampley was there. That's why they had national figures there. That's why they were talking about national topics. And then they realized quickly, in the minds of advertisers and the minds of listeners in New York, again, pre-internet, that we want to hear about New York stories. And this is a New York station about New York sports. And so they figured that out quickly. They geared their talent towards that. They ended up selling ads toward that end. And when you parlay that with having the Mets, which was a play-by-play, the Mets being the flagship station for the Mets at a time when the Mets were the team in town, that was the marriage made in heaven. That's what really allowed them to take off. Within a few years, Mike and Chris took off and carried that mantle. But it was those decisions made in the 80s. What can we do and parlay that with what the power of being the Met station to make it succeed? And that's really what happened.
So you're getting into this, and you're mentioning it's New York. We want New York stories, New York feelings, and part of New York is the scandalous behind-the-scenes stuff. Now, you've mentioned that you didn't want to write a book like that. It was more of a labor of love, more than at the same time. I mean, ESPN had done recently. James Andrew Miller had released a book. Quite the opposite. Now, was it hard for you to resist to really go for that, or was that just not your intention, so you weren't even looking for that information?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, for sure. When the reviews came out and people started looking at my book, which was flattering for sure, I think some people decided to think that maybe in the buildup of hearing that there was a book and listening to the FAN and hearing that something like this was coming out, that it might be a scandalous story of sports personalities in the heart of New York City winning and losing at life. And in reality, a couple of things along those lines. I didn't really want to go that way because I didn't think that that's the kind of book that FAN readers and listeners wanted to hear about. I wanted this to be a perspective of what made this station great and why we love it. We're not listening to the fan every day because of bad news. We're listening to it because of good news. So that was sort of my primary focus. And along the way, realistically, doing research and talking to people involved in the station for hours on end, at the same time, there really weren't that many controversial stories. This isn't a TV station where people, up until, Mike and the Mad Dog were on the Yes Network, This isn't a station where people had a lot of face value. A lot of people didn't know who Steve Summers was or what he looked like. A lot of people didn't know what Mike and Chris looked like until '01 when they got onto the Yes Network. So it was very much, I wanted to tell a story of who these folks were, how they made a station great. And along the way, two things. I really didn't want to expose too much negativity. And quite frankly, along the way, I learned that there wasn't really a whole lot of negativity.
Okay, yeah, you sort of answered my next question. I was going to say, well, there had to be something that you really wanted to put in there. But hey, if nothing's there, you're not going to sit there and make up stuff.
Sure.
You're researching. You mentioned you're going through all of this. How long did the project take from beginning to end?
It took about 2 years all told. I started researching, collecting interviews while I was finishing up my Rangers book in 2011. One sort of led into the other. I was able to secure the deal for the FAN book along the way of writing the first one. And so I knew I wanted to hit the ground running. And I knew realistically, having tape and having some of the classic recordings was all great, but at the end of the day, this was going to be a book about talk radio people talking to me. So it was more collecting interviews, finding times to talk to folks, finding them in their element. Some of the play-by-play folks who started at the station who are now national TV broadcasters. I went out to some of the games with them, watched what they did, talked to them before and after, sat down with some of the bigger folks at the station 2 or 3 different times for about 3 or 4 hours each. So realistically, it took about 2 years to get everybody confirmed, to have people talk to me, to record it all down, and to start writing. It was interesting in talking. We've mentioned some of the bigger names that we all know involved with the station. It was interesting, sort of the cat and mouse game that a lot of them gave me. They were all interested in me writing the book. They were all, there was no pushback at all. They wanted to be a part of it, but it was very interesting to see how one of them would usually, it was sort of a domino game in which one of them would come back to me and say, have you talked to this person yet? Have you talked to that person yet? And if I hadn't talked to that list, they didn't want to talk to me. So come back and talk to me when you've talked to this, this, and this.
Oh,
so it was very much a little game of dominoes, but it was fun. The chase, the beauty was in the chase there. At the end of the day, as you know, and hopefully the readers appreciate it, we had everybody in there that needed to be in there for sure.
Anybody resistant that would flat out not talk to you?
No, to be honest with you, I would say maybe a few people who were started at FAN and had gone on to other companies who were, I wouldn't say primary people in the book, but maybe to give me some supporting information that I never really connected with.
Okay.
But I had a primary list of current and former FAN folks that I wanted to get on there, and I got them all. And the beauty of writing a book about people who talk for a living is that they talk very, very well when you get them on the phone. And in many, many ways, the book wrote itself because of that.
I can imagine a few people that you have in the book just continuing to talk for very, 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 very long. You hear the hosts and anyone that's worked for WFAN talk about the old Astoria studios. Did you get a chance to go into that dungeon, that dank pit that they all talk about?
Yes, absolutely. Fun stuff, and it was advertised.
It was as bad as they said it was.
Yeah, as advertised, and it ended up becoming a great icebreaker, especially for some of those folks who I talked to that aren't there anymore, or maybe are still there and have great studios now in the heart of Manhattan, and can look back and laugh at some of those old days. But Ian Eagle told some great stories about that place. People who even moved on, like Don LaGreca, who are at ESPN now. He told some great stories about it. And there's one thing, that's the beauty of writing that book and talking to upwards of 4 or 5 different hosts a week for months, is that one story that I had just maybe gotten off the phone with somebody would roll right into another interview the next day. And while some stories would sometimes conflict, some people didn't always remember that caller or this caller. One thing they always remember were those studios and what it looked like. And in many, many ways, they wear it as a badge of courage.
Did anyone, you're dealing with people with different personalities, different egos. Was there anyone you went in there looking to interview who were saying, that this isn't going to be fun? And it turned out that he or she was actually a very nice person.
I wouldn't say that I was pessimistic about any one or two hosts. What I would say is that you open the door to some hosts that you might know in a different light. That I ended up having, the absolute best 2-3 hour conversations with that you just never knew. I'll give you a perfect example. Dave Sims, who is the Seattle Mariners play-by-play host now, and the former co-host for Coleman and the Soul Man, which was one of their many midday excursions that Evan and Joe now hold in the midday slot. Just a terrific person who knows sports media in and out, knows the sports newspaper business that I came up in so well. But I don't, because I was I was in college at the time and I was out of town and we didn't have the internet. The Coleman and the Soulman was at a time where I wasn't listening to the fan every day. So sitting down and talking to both really Dave Sims and Ed Coleman about how that show came together, what they were able to do, the relationships and the bonds that they have now covering baseball because of what they did together. That's just two examples of folks that may be just a little bit off the FAN radar that, I found myself, doing this book for the love of it. Because they were so passionate, they were so smart, they were so intelligent, and they had so many great memories of FAN that I didn't know about.
Another friend of the podcast, Dave Sims. I'm just tooting my own horn here. He was very nice when he came on, so I could see that. Now I got a few questions here from Twitter. The first one, I'm not sure if you're going to know. Well, let me just ask it. This is from Mick _Mongo99. Did Imus ever make up with Bill Clinton after the infamous 1996 Correspondents' Dinner? I don't know if that came up in your conversations with Don Imus.
That did not. Don was very forthcoming in his interview. We talked to him for a good 2.5 hours, and it was a time where, for sure, catching him in 2012. Has certainly moved on in life and was, while he may have been short with some other interviews, there were some stories before about FAN that he wasn't a part of. I felt flattered that he wanted to be a part of my book. We didn't get into Bill Clinton. We got into a lot of things, and he was very, very forthcoming in the book, especially with regards to Mike and Chris. But Bill Clinton did not come up. I'm sorry about that one.
And another one here from HK Collectibles, and I know we're trying to keep it positive here, but I believe Steve Summers said in your book that he was not a fan of this person. Did Russ Salzberg get along with anyone?
That's a good question. I mentioned the midday time slot that Evan and Joe have now, and anyone who's a fan of the fan, has been for a while, knows that is a time slot that they've always, I don't want to say struggled with, but have used it to see what works. And I mentioned Coleman and the Soul Man. You mentioned the Sweater and the Schmoozer. There are others, Joe Benigno and Sid Rosenberg.
Right.
It's one of those difficult spots because at the time, way back when, with Imus at the peak of his popularity in New York, at least, ending in the morning, and Mike and Chris building up to their peak of popularity in New York, waiting in the wings at 1 o'clock. There was a little bit of a lag time there. That what is the FAN going to do? What are we going to do to keep people interested? Plus, Imus is coming off talking about news, politics, and stories of the world, and FAN needed to transition right back into all sports all the time. So it's been a tough spot. They tried many different genres, and credit to them for trying different things. I think with Russ, it was one of these situations where Steve, I think he would tell you, had built his brand as the overnight host, as a solo host. He had a legion of fans that came to know his shtick, came to know his intros, came to know his songs. And I think at the end of the day, Russ, coming in from TV, built his own brand. He was sort of loud. He was brash. He was in your face. He had his own brand too. And it just wasn't a match made in heaven. I don't think that either of them, looking back on it, I remember distinctly talking to both of them about it. They do have memories of the show. They both learned from it. I think FAN learned from it. But at the end of the day, I think it was more that it wasn't just a perfect fit. I don't think anybody walked away from the situation with Russ included, seeing that it was a situation where anyone didn't like anybody. It was just something that didn't fit, and I think it's professionals deciding to go different ways.
It's crazy thinking Joe and Evan have been there for, 8, 9 years in the middays, when you're right, before it was sort of, let's see what works. Let's try a little different here, a little different there. It's crazy to think that they've been together that long.
It's absolutely. It's been a rotating wheel. And the thing about a lot of those hosts and those teams is that not necessarily didn't work. It just, they wanted to, that was a position that they always knew that they could probably get better or do something different. And Evan and Joe fit into that really, really well. I think they're, as the voice of the fan, so to speak, and I don't mean FAM, but I mean as a sports fan, maybe more so than Mike and some other hosts that have come through the doors there. Joe and Evan really are fans before maybe even radio professionals, I would say. And I think that comes across in their stick, and they're very, very good at it. And I think a lot of fans, Jets, Mets, obviously, especially, have really latched on to that. And, I think one of the ultimate compliments for fan hosts, and this is something that I've talked to a lot of people who've passed through the doors, is when people want, when and I mentioned this in the book a few times, and I mentioned it in some of the reviews, when people watch something that happens over the weekend, let's just call it a Jets game because we're talking about Evan and Joe. When it comes to those fans walking out of that stadium that day or walking away from their couch after a loss, and they want to say to themselves, I can't wait to hear what Evan and Joe are going to say about the Jets tomorrow. That's a great compliment, and I think that's when you know that midday works. Is that when people are saying, walking out of a Jets loss, saying, "What is Joe going to say? What are we going to hear tomorrow at 10:06?" And that's a great compliment. I think they've really found their fit there. That
is the number one reason why Mike Francesa says he will not go on Twitter. Why am I going to give my voice, the momentum I have behind my voice away for free to the world? So it's always about money's involved with Mike. We'll just put it that way. So you mentioned you talked about this earlier, and we weren't going to hold you to it, but I know it's not covered in the book, but I think I'd be doing a disservice to the audience if I did not bring up the phenomenon of WFAN's biggest star, Mike Francesa. There's a lot of crazy people all over this country, including myself, who's elevated him to some status that's just, it's unbelievable. I'm rambling. Let's get here. Are you a member of Mongo Nation?
I am. I'm a closet member, I would say. I haven't been to Francesa Con. I didn't go to Radio City. But there's no question I follow it, and I laugh along with everybody. It's truly amazing what he's turned into. It's truly amazing how he's embraced it, in my opinion, over the last 2 years. And he really is an unbelievable national and maybe even international superstar. And when you have a thing like FrancesaCon that Chris Russo has to go to, right, to be a guest, when Francesa's name is on it, here's Francesa, here's Russo as a satellite national radio host being the guest of honor as opposed to the person who's essentially hosting the event. That says something about where Mike has come and how he's embraced it. I think for a while there, he didn't know what to expect with social media and this younger generation of fans. Yeah, but now he has completely embraced it.
His relationship with social media and the internet in general was sort of I don't want to use the word ignorance, but just I'm going to ignore it. I'm not going to embrace it. Then I'm going to mention it sometimes, question its validity, and then I'm going to embrace it, and all of a sudden become some sort of, I don't want to go as far as say cultural icon, but you understand what I mean. Become an icon of the sports talk radio world. We'll put it that way.
Sure, and he surprises a lot of people along those ways. It's no different than him giving me 3 hours of interviews for this book. I remember talking to some folks who were very near and dear to him, Ian Eagle being one of them. I remember talking to Ian Eagle in the press box at a Jets game. Not long after I'd interviewed Ian, he was doing play-by-play for the Jets. It was a preseason game, and we were talking about building the construction of the book. And Ian to give me many, many hours. Great storyteller, terrific storyteller, and a good friend. And we were going over who's going to talk to me and who's not going to talk to me. And we went through the list, and when we got down to Mike, Ian, who was a producer for Mike and Chris, saying, "There's no chance." I can see now Ian's head shaking and saying, "There's no chance. There's no chance." And I don't want to say again that I use it as motivation, but I put it on it and at the bottom of the list. And I mentioned earlier that there were several folks that came to me and said, when you talk to this person, you can talk to me. And I'll let the cat out of the bag there. The last one there for sure was Mike, who came to me and said, when I got through to him for the third or fourth time, he said, "Have you talked to Imus yet?" And I said, "Yes." "Really? Okay." That was a good one. And he said, "Have you talked to Chris yet?" I said, "Yes, 3 times." He said, "Really? Okay." So I was ready for okay, let's talk right now. And I said, "Can we talk?" And then he was one of those, set me up just to finish. He's like, "Call me back in 3 weeks." So, so that's what I did. And 3 weeks later, to his credit, he stuck to his word.
Nice.
Gave me an emotional 3 hours, and showed many of the characteristics in that interview that I think he's shown at FrancesaCon and on Radio City, and all over the place now. Is that there's, in many ways, there's the Mike Francesa that we know from 1 to 6:30 every weekday. And there's also a Mike Francesa that you get in some moments that is incredibly passionate about his fans, about the people who made him who he is today. And it's good to see now that so many people are, whether they laugh about it or not, I think a lot of them do. It's good to see now that people have seen that side of him, for sure.
No, that's a great point. I mean, with someone like Mike, I've been listening since I was a kid. You have to laugh at it, but you appreciate it at the same time. It's a little bit. You have to take the good with the bad. Now,
absolutely.
Mike and the Mad Dog, they got together. Like you said, he was at FrancesaCon. They did the Radio City Music Hall thing. There's the 30 for 30. That's just a tease, right? They're not getting back together. This is not happening, correct?
It'd be incredibly tough, to be honest with you, even contractually, if they could all figure out a way to make it work. I think that, what I wrote in the book about Chris and through Chris's eyes and the quotes that I put in there from Chris are true. And I think that in many respects, he truly, truly enjoys being able to rant about the French Open or the San Francisco Giants and not have to worry about catering to a New York audience. Now, would he do that if the stars were on? Yes, he would. But I believe him when he tells me that he absolutely loves that national stage and forum. Whether his future is at Sirius or not, or whether it's on MLB Network, there is a fit there that is international and national and beyond the borders of New York. That really, really suits Chris. And he'll go off and he can talk for a 20-minute segment on the Milwaukee Brewers if that's what's really got him going, and doesn't have to sort of page himself into Mets Yankees. Not that they're not good stories, but I truly believe he likes that. For Mike, he's the exact opposite. While he would certainly go back to national topics and does a very good job, obviously, with national topics and has a television career with CBS in the past talking about national topics, I still think at the end of the day, especially given what's happened to him lately in the social media world and becoming the celebrity figure he is, at the end of the day, he's still tied to New York. And he lives and breathes with New York sports, is New York through and through. So while it could happen, yes, contractually, I don't know where it would be. It probably wouldn't be at FAN, and it could happen. Yeah. I don't know that it would ever work. And quite frankly, for people who remember the classic Mike and the Mad Dog days of the 90s, the early 2000s, even back to when the show first started, and the memories most people have of their childhoods listening to Mike and the Mad Dog, to me, it was never going to be the same.
No, never.
It's a reunion tour, and we all know that bands, when they come back 20 years later, don't sound the way they used to.
No, not at all. So finally here, we talked about old guys that have been at WFAN forever, guys that have moved on. And Mike, in classic Francesa form, has announced not his retirement, but leaving WFAN in 2017. And you got to think a lot of the old timers there, Ed Coleman, Steve Summers, guys like that. In the next few years, they're going to be, moving on to greener pastures and greater pastures possibly. In your opinion, what does the future hold for WFAN? Broad question, I know, but.
It is a broad question. I think what Mike, to steal a line from Mike, and I think it's accurate. He's not doing it to toot his own horn. Maybe he is a little bit, but radio is not what it used to be. And sports media in general is not what it used to be. The rise of a local television, a local radio show like Mike and Chris taking off to the levels that it did, I don't know if it's even possible anymore because of satellite radio, because of internet radio, because there's so many options for folks to listen to certain things in the car. That have to listen to mode, where we all knew, hey, we needed to listen to Mike and Chris after that Knicks loss or that Rangers win or that Giants Super Bowl. That may not be, that may be fading away. And I think when Mike goes away, that 1 to 6 time slot is as big as it used to be for a lot of reasons. But one of which is because there's a generation that may not realize that 1 to 6:30 is the most important radio that we're going to have in New York. And I think that's a decision that FAN has to figure out, that they are not going to be able to replace Mike with a new Mike. It's going to be a different show, a different format. It's going to be a whole different feel. They may have that person on staff. I know they love Evan Roberts and his potential and his upside. I think some of the newer folks that have come in, whether they've won the fan contest or they've come in from other stations like John Jastrzemski, I think he's got a world of talent. I think they're very well positioned to do great things at FAN. But at the same time, I think the days of the rise of a national superstar coming from a local radio station, as big as this local radio station is, I think is over with. And I think once Mike is over with, it's going to be a whole new look. I'm not sure that Mike is going to walk away forever. It might be a spot on a TV show. He might be an analyst. He can do whatever he wants. But I don't think when he walks away from that contract that we've seen the last of him, he won't be able to stay away from the microphone.
Absolutely.
And the city of New York for very long. That's for sure. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, I'm not even totally convinced he's going to leave in 2017, honestly. He probably will, don't get me wrong, but I mean, I would not be shocked if he said, "Yeah, well, we're going to give it a few more years." I mean, I love it.
Absolutely.
I love what I do. So, he is the author of Imus, Mike and the Mad Dog, Doris from Rego Park, the Groundbreaking History of WFAN, Timothy Sullivan. Thank you for coming on the podcast. But before you go, I have 3 quick questions for you. You ready?
Sure.
All right, number 1, who is your favorite caller of all time?
Favorite caller of all time? Good question. I would say, and Steve Summers might be able to agree with this. There was a Lenny from Manhattan, sort of an underrated caller who was an overnight sensation with Steve, and even the early overnight days of Joe Benito. And again, this was pre-internet, or at least pre-explosion of the internet. And Lenny from Manhattan, who didn't make the book, and I couldn't track him down, always came with incredibly informed takes of whatever team he was talking about, whether it was the Giants on a Sunday night after a loss, whether it was the Rangers in the middle of the playoffs. He would have these incredibly educational takes, was able to dive into games like no other caller I'd ever heard in a pre-internet era, where he had all this research. I just imagine him being in a basement somewhere in Manhattan, watching these games, taping them, rewinding them, and scripting out his calls so that when he called the snoozer overnight, he knew that he was going to be the best 7 minutes of radio. I'll never forget Lenny from not the funniest guy in the world, but an unbelievably informed, educational guy who really stood out to me as someone that if things broke right, he could be on the radio full time.
Oh, very interesting. Number 2, in the history of WFAN, what is the number 1 sports moment in New York City?
That's a good question. I would say, wow, that's in FAN's lifetime, a lot of great things happened. I remember talking to Chris distinctly about that, and whether it was the Giants in '91, sort of signaling a new era of championships in New York after a long layoff, and some of the Yankees championships that obviously didn't happen on the air, but they were able to wrap themselves around. But I would say, no question, not to plug my first book, but
go ahead.
But the spring of '94, when the Knicks and Rangers had sort of turned the whole city and the whole country really on the building in the middle of Manhattan, and every other night there was a big playoff game with superstars coming in and out of the place. Obviously, the Knicks didn't finish off. The Rangers were able to, but I remember talking to so many of the hosts on FAN, Mike and Chris, obviously Harry Rose, who was on the call, for Rangers radio back then. Ian Eagle, Steve Summers, you name it. I can remember distinctly, almost tears. I can hear the tears in the eyes of Steve Summers when we were talking about that summer of '94 and taking some of the emotional calls that he took from Ranger fans. To me, for sure, there's been a lot of titles since FAN went on the air, for sure. But I would say for sure, in terms of calls, in terms of the city wrapping itself around it, in terms of a magic moment for FAN, I would say for sure it was the summer of '94 with the Rangers winning it all.
All right, and number 3, will Mike Francesa ever join Twitter?
That's a good question. I'm going to say no on that one because he doesn't need to. I think that at some point in his life, if he hasn't already, people will continue. People that he's so close to will be able to feed him everything he gets off of Twitter. But right now, it's one of those things where he's so big on that without even having to ever make a tweet himself, why jump down? He can use that as his launching pad and tell us on the air that I am a legend on Twitter without ever having to pen a tweet. And that's a pretty cool thing that most people can't say. One thing that Mike can say that he has on all of us.
He probably has some sort of account that he doesn't tweet from and just sort of watches everything from afar.
Yes, and Julio, when he's driving him home at night, tells him the best tweets of the day.
Oh, tell it again, Julio. All right. He is the author, like he said, of Battle on the Hudson and the Groundbreaking History of WFAN. Timothy Sullivan, thank you for coming on the Red Ticket Blues podcast.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
So there you have it, Timothy Sullivan. Just wonderful, wonderful stuff about WFAN, and a great guy coming on, just going through the book and his preparation, and very, very appreciative of his contribution to the Red Ticket Blues podcast. Remember, you can always listen to the show. Before I do that, I know you know where you can listen to the show. I just want to say a wonderful congratulations to the other part of this podcast, the content manager, editor, producer, and that is my wonderful wife, who will, in a few months, she'll be graduating, but she has learned that she will be receiving her PhD from the University of Chicago, and I could not be more proud of her and the hard work she has put into it. It's one thing to be live and pre-recorded. It's another thing to get your PhD from the University of Chicago. So I want to give a large, large congratulations to her because she certainly deserves all the congratulations she gets. So remember, you can always listen to the show on iTunes, TuneIn Radio, Stitcher, YouTube, and follow me on Twitter at BrianBuck13 and at Red Ticket Blues. Like the show on Facebook, and remember to subscribe. Just do it. Subscribe and leave a rating if you really want to. So with all that being said, I'm out of here. Mike in the